Daryl and Randy, thank you guys for joining. Thanks for sharing out today.
Thanks for that, Brian. Randy, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Daryl Doty. Like Brian said, I'm the Director of Professional Services. Been here for 23 years, been in IT for over 35. That's kind of aging myself. If you look in there, you'll actually see Nobel and Banyan Vine. So I've been around for a little while. I am out of the Dallas office, so I am a native Texas boy. And yes, I am a United States Navy veteran. Randy.
Yep. So thanks, Daryl. So as you can tell, Iowa State alum. Unfortunately, did not do well the other day. They did not show up to the game, much like the Chiefs the other day. That's okay. We'll get over that. We always have next year, right? We'll look forward to that. But I am an Iowa-born native. Went and did some things outside of Iowa for a while, and I've recently come back. Unfortunately, I'm on the wrong side of the state, about 30 minutes north of University of Iowa, our arch rival, but that's okay. It did mean that I get to meet my wife over here, so that's been worth it. So, from that perspective, again, to Brian's point, been with the company. It'll be 16 years for me here in August. So it's been a real experience and journey with the team and organization, and I think some of the things that Brian mentioned is why I know for myself, I'm still here, and likely why Daryl's still here as well. It's really about that we care and we value and we want to do the right thing. And that's important. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into kind of a quick look at. Oh, I forgot to move the slide. So a little bit about me. Sorry. Do enjoy camping, hunting, fishing. That's almost the season to start doing those kind of things again and get outside of this tundra cold that we've had. But yeah, and then I live up in Marion, Iowa. So again, just north of the University of Iowa here. So kind of coming at you from the north and from the south. I'm not even going to ask Daryl what his temperature is down there because I don't want to be depressed. So with that, we're going to move on. So kind of a little bit about when we start talking about the agenda for what we want to cover today. So this is kind of a topic we've talked about a little bit. And what we really wanted to do is sit down and we've had the opportunity to work with a number of customers over a period of time. To Brian said, this is not a, hey, this is that turning the dial, right? We want to start and then how do we make the journey if we really sit down and say, I want to go to the cloud, right? How do we go about getting there? So what we wanted to talk about is some of the things that you need to understand. So we're going to level set a little bit of an understanding about what is the cloud, right? Let's just level set. So we're all talking the same vocabulary since cloud is such a kind of thrown around nebulous term. We're going to get into what are some of the business advantages and how you need to make sure you're really aligning the business advantages with the strategy to go to the cloud. If you're going to cloud because somebody told you to go to the cloud, that's probably not going to end well. And you probably need to take a step back and really understand why are we going to the cloud? What is the business advantage and how do we best approach the business advantage and outcome we're looking for from moving to the cloud? The other thing is timing. Timing is everything, right? There are some key time indicators and some key opportunities that you want to definitely take a hard look at and prepare in advance of those things becoming reality. That may be good fits where you can look to make logical, natural segues into moving systems or services into the cloud on those key kind of timing points. And then finally, the real chunk of this is going to be getting into strategic planning. And this is really where we want to sit down and look like, how do you go about this entire journey? What are the key components and pieces? How to get started, and where you can certainly do it on your own, and where we can kind of plug in on how we've had success with other customers and going down this path. So with that, what is the cloud? So if you pull up any of the generative AIs and ask that question, you get basically a result that looks very similar to this, right? So essentially, it's when you're going to consume any sort of IT service, data, outside of an environment that is directly under your control. That's essentially how they consider the cloud. I would say it's a little off because they do have the nomenclature we'll get into a little bit about private cloud, which technically is kind of a cloud you're operating and still running services out of. It's some nuancy, but again, that's kind of the definition we're going to use today to kind of define what is the cloud. And then, kind of how does it work, right? So again, as we mentioned, this is where you're not really paying per se for the overall platform that you're running on top of. And with the exception of private cloud, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But where you're consuming services and you're paying just for the service or component of that service you're consuming, that's really what we're talking about. Those are cloud. That's where you're really leveraging cloud componentry. So as I've mentioned, there's kind of really four major kind of components when we talk about cloud. First is your public cloud. And so this is your big hyper web scaler. So this is going to be Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud Platform, Microsoft Azure, right? We've probably all, at least at some level, heard of those big players in the public cloud space. And so anytime you're consuming services, maybe it's G Suite, maybe it's M or O365, right? You're technically on a public cloud service at that point. Now it's classified a little bit differently in terms, and we'll break that down a little bit in just the next slide here. But technically, that's a public cloud service you're consuming today. So whether you thought you were in the cloud or not, most of us probably already are in a limited fashion, right? And so this is one of the conversations we have a lot of times where people like, I don't want to go to the cloud. I don't trust the cloud. Well, are you running G Suite? Are you running Microsoft? You're already in the cloud. You've already made that direction and some of the dependencies come along with it. So let's continue to maybe talk a little bit more about why do we have this phobia about cloud, if that is the case, and how do we kind of work around those concerns and or educate around the capabilities. Private cloud, as I mentioned, this is one of the things that we've kind of really, since the introduction of um, the hyperconverged category, has really kind of become something where we can talk a little bit about private cloud and some of the technology they brought into those stacks. And so the one we most commonly, I think you probably saw on the slide that Brian shared with us earlier, is going to be Nutanix running Acropolis Hypervisor, right? That is a scale out compute platform that allows us to virtualize and run a lot of the same service type capabilities that you get from these big web hyperscalers that we mentioned earlier in public cloud, but you can actually own the infrastructure and hardware in your own data center. In certain situations, you may need to have that. Maybe you've got on-prem manufacturing equipment. Maybe you've got data or latency requirements that you can't have that is tied to something on-prem that can't, due to the cloud latencies and the connectivities or speeds, we simply can't move it. So there's still a place today, and in some cases it's a combination, right? And that's where we get into hybrid cloud. Maybe there's some things that have to remain on-prem and be in that kind of private cloud arena, but doesn't mean we can't still leverage the things that fit in public cloud and tie them together, right? We have to be very thoughtful and mindful about how are the users accessing the apps and data, where are they at, and how we get them as close as possible to minimize any changes in the user experience. So again, that's part of the strategy we'll talk about a little bit more. And the final one, this is really kind of that, hey, if you're in an environment where you've determined you need full disaster recovery and you run a secondary data center site, and then you go to look to move to the cloud. Yes, cloud has multiple regions. You could put resources in Azure East and resources in Azure West, and you could fail back and forth between them. But if Microsoft has a catastrophic failure, which let's be honest, if they do, we're all going to have a really bad day in IT no matter what happens. But if you were to instead of going to just Azure East, you went to AWS data center on the West Coast. Now you have agnosticity and you have resiliency across even the public cloud providers. And so that's where we get into looking at like multi-cloud. And you can do the same kind of thing from that perspective, but it allows us to have some resiliency across those public cloud providers where, again, you don't have a direct recourse in most cases to go back to them, but we can actually be fault tolerant across it. So the next part I kind of talked about and alluded to a little bit, we'll jump into is this cloud service models. So this is really how you consume cloud services. So as I mentioned earlier, most of us are probably at software as a service, the SaaS model, right? We've consumed most likely a G Suite or an O365, and that's how we're getting our email and our Office licensing or whatever it might be. And so that is a software as a service model. You're subscribing to a license and you're getting a service back in return. You have zero control of the infrastructure. You don't know where it runs. Honestly, you really don't care, right? That's the beauty of the software as a service. You get the service, it does what it needs to do, and you just pay for your usage of that service on some typically monthly or annual fee. Platform as a service is kind of taking that next step kind of back from a true software, but it's providing services like SQL as a service. So in that environment, you're running SQL instances that Microsoft is using their best practices to deploy redundant SQL instances, keep them patched and maintained, and then you're just simply installing your databases on top of them. So it takes that, maybe that underlying SQL infrastructure knowledge away and being handled by Microsoft best practice in terms of patch security and updating. And all you have to worry about is just loading and maintaining your database. So that's an example of a PaaS service. They also have Active Directory as a service inside of Azure as well that can integrate with your Entra ID. So that's another kind of an example of some of those platforms and services that are out there. And then probably the model we're all most familiar with or kind of go akin back to is when the hyperscalers first came out, it was really infrastructure as a service, right? How do I take my VMware VM I have today, And how do I translate that into cloud? Well, I'm going to go get CPU, I'm going to get memory, I'm going to go get disk, and I'm going to deploy it in there as a resource on top of that hyperscaler platform. That's really infrastructure as a service. You're paying for the resources you're consuming in a what they call like a t-shirt size model, right? And so that's kind of what those three models really represent in terms of when we go into cloud. So now we kind of established cloud, some of the components and services. Let's jump into what are the benefits, right? So again, I'm here to tell you that if you're trying to save costs, you, in most cases, that's probably not going to be realistic unless you're going to go run down the cost of your air handling and cooling for your data center, your power, everything else. Like if you really want to do that, you could probably maybe find some savings. But again, the benefits of the cloud really come into a flexibility and scalability, right? We can easily change configurations of resources on a VM on the fly and then pay for those resources as we use them. And then if we ratchet it back down, that cost goes away. Or if we, a lot of cases, when we have to come in and size those capital expenditures for net new infrastructure, we're having to plan that for 3 to 5 years, depending on the depreciation and life cycle. And when we're going to have to do a refresh or update, when we go to do that, we have to assume what's in there today, what's some growth capacity. So you're paying for that out the gate. When you go to cloud, that model changes, right? Because now we can, on a dime, spin up what we need when we need it, and when we don't need it, we spin it back down, and we're not paying for it. So that's where you can start to see some of the potential cost savings. DR and business continuity is probably one of the best and most widely used use cases from a cloud perspective. We can get the data into the cloud. We can recover it in the cloud. We have business continuity. We can fail between data centers or physical, again, Azure East, Azure West locations at relatively minimal cost compared to what it would cost us if we were trying to do that from a traditional on-prem infrastructure, having multiple data centers with infrastructure and hardware replicating across each other, and then doing the checks and the services to go back and forth to maintain that. Remote accessibility, again, these data centers are everywhere, right? So we can access these services really from pretty much anywhere. And because of the investments the hyperscalers have made in terms of their access paths into their environments, no matter where you're at in the world, you can really get into these services. Now, again, latency is still a factor. I'm not going to negate that. But again, it just makes these things even more accessible to our workforce. Obviously, automatic updates. I want to touch on this one just for a minute because this is important. One of the things, and this is specifically with Microsoft Azure, is that if you are in a situation where you still have to run legacy operating systems, one of the unique things that Azure has done is the fact that you can run legacy operating systems with extended security updates inside of Azure at no additional cost. So if you have to run 2012 and there's an application you haven't been able to get transitioned or migrated off of yet since that went end of life last year, you have the opportunity using extended security updates natively in Azure. That's just provided. But if you still have on-prem services, we can deploy services in conjunction with Azure to manage your on-prem resources and provide extended security updates. So I know something I see quite a bit in the field when we're talking to customers and environments. So just be aware there's some things that you can do even today for your on-prem environment that leverage cloud that allow you to maybe extend that life to give you the time you need to refactor the application and move to whatever is next and get off of that legacy operating system. The other thing is this is the scale of faster innovation. I mean, again, it's the switch of a knob. We can be running something new tomorrow or change. And, I've got some situations where maybe you want to go test a GPU delivered workload. I mean, in the day of AI that we're in and living in the day, GPUs are continuing to become more and more critical for different workloads and different things you might be looking at trying to accomplish. We can easily spin up a VM inside of these hyperscalers that has GPU attached to it. And then we can test or pilot whatever workload you might want to be doing from that perspective. So while there's some good cases, there's also some things we need to be aware of. As we mentioned, there's some situations that just don't always align it to being in the cloud. So one of those is if you need absolute full control across the entire stack, you're probably not going to be going to the cloud because there's a certain level when you go to cloud that the hyperscalers provide, even in a private cloud or like a colo or whatever else. And then from that point up, you have some responsibilities. High data ingress egress. So one of the things that we do get billed for is in and out speeds on the network. And so that can be if there's a lot of chat or you're moving a lot of data back and forth between environments, this may be a cost prohibitor to moving to cloud. Regulatory requirements, right? Maybe you got a regulatory requirement that we just can't meet or can't facilitate in the cloud. maybe a reason you have to stay or can't go to the cloud. That's where that private cloud conversation would come into play. Network connectivity, I've seen this a lot. Again, I'm in Iowa. There are a lot of rural communities here that we do work and serve. In some cases, again, they just don't have the internet circuits or bandwidth. So sometimes we have to simply look and say, okay, maybe this isn't a good fit because today the networking capabilities and bandwidth aren't there. So maybe it's a conversation we circle back to in 2 or 3 years and we can look and see, has the technology or the networking capabilities changed enough that we can come back and have that conversation? So those are the things that we're looking for that may be, not ideal. Not saying we can't work around some of those in certain situations, and we have, but those are things to watch out for as well that may be indicators that you may have a harder journey moving to cloud. So with that, the next part of the conversation we're talking about is when is the right time? Because timing's key, right? So one of the, as we mentioned earlier, you got to be aligned with business strategy, right? If you're not aligned with, and again, it can't just be go to cloud, right? You've got to understand why are we going to cloud and what are the business goals we're trying to accomplish by going to cloud. That's probably one of the key important things. A lot of people go to cloud and they're like, oh, well, this is what I expected. I expected to save cost. Well, that's probably not a realistic expectation. So let's go establish those business criteria and strategy of what we're trying to get accomplished, make sure that it's reasonable. And we've educated our executives about what can and can't be done from that perspective. A common transition that I've seen more recently is that honestly, folks are tired of the constant CapEx refresh hardware infrastructure project cycle. And so by moving to the OpEx model, we can go and be much more fluid. You have the OSs, you have the environment, you're able to run. We have extended, get security updates included in the platform so you can run those OSs even longer if we have to actually do an OS refresh, which then you can, in a lot of cases, more logically tie that to an actual, hey, I have an app update, so I'm going to refresh the OS to the latest version it supports, and now I can extend that life even further. Again, security and compliance, there are things like Gov Cloud specifically for if you're a government agency or whatever else, there's certain capabilities you have to go into the Gov Cloud. You can't just use public cloud, but there are capabilities around those feature sets. Again, this is kind of double-edged sword. There's things we can do to help facilitate security and compliance in the cloud because most of the cloud providers are natively certified for a lot of the big compliance requirements. But with the caveat, once you go in there and start deploying services, you have to ensure you maintain that level of security and compliance. So that's where the trigger comes into play. One of the other things is, do you have the IT resource and talent, or do you have a partner or service provider you're going to work with to help get you there and then maintain that environment once you're there? One of the things we're going to talk about a little bit more is that cloud is not I move and I'm done, right? Cloud is constantly innovating, changing, evolving. And so we have to understand that we're going to have to constantly be monitoring, operationalizing the environment. And one of the biggest things we have to do on the journey is making sure we're managing the financial side of this. Because again, that can very quickly, if you're not paying attention, run away as well. And we certainly don't want to have that happen. Again, performance and DR, great conversation point, like we talked about earlier. And then again, digital transformation. Maybe you're trying to uplift and transition your entire stack to more modern apps or whatever it might be. This is, again, the time. So what we've seen from the projects we've been involved with, the customers that we've been able to kind of help through this process and journey, hardware refreshes are a prime time to take a look at this, right? But don't wait till your hardware refresh is coming up. You need to start looking at this 12 months out, right? Start evaluating, hey, I've got a hardware refresh I want to have to do. My hardware's going to go into life. I'm going to have to do something. What does that look like? What are the apps that I have? What are the capabilities that I have today that I need to have go someplace? What could I potentially start carving off? Maybe I carve off some of it, and maybe I have a smaller footprint I have to refresh this year. And then in 2 or 3 years, 5 years, whatever it is, we go and we look at that again. Maybe we carve off even more. So again, it's a journey. It's not hey, I'm going to do it tomorrow. New applications and or upgrades, right? I'm seeing a lot of application vendors are coming out now with new versions, and part of that new version stack is, oh, by the way, we now have a SaaS version. We'll run for you in the cloud. You don't have to manage the infrastructure, anything else. You don't have to go through the cycles. So that's something else to always be looking at and considering. One of the other things to do, don't try to make a transition during your busiest time of year, right? If you've got business cycles that let's identify a time to make sure we're strategically planning for doing outside of peak business criteria. And again, mergers and acquisitions, we see this a lot as well. Hey, I just acquired this. It's on a completely different platform. I need to consolidate it. Where do I go? Right? That's an easy place as well in terms of key timing events that may trigger. Hey, we really should take a step back for a minute and really see what's there from a cloud perspective. So obviously there's good things, but there's also some risky ones, right? If you've got an annual static budget, this may not be ideal, or you're going to understand how to maintain within those budgets. Because again, in the cloud, things are going to fluctuate. You can put some controls, you can help reduce that. And there's different things we do with our customer base to help maintain and adhere to that. But again, those budgets are going to fluctuate some. And at any point in time, you're consuming a cloud service. Those prices can potentially change as well. So keep that in the back of your mind. HIPAA, GDR, ITAR, some of those requirements, those are things that make things a lot more complicated because now you've got to potentially put resources in a specific region or location that may not be where the rest of your environment is going to be. And then you have to connect it all up, which may incur additional costs. As we mentioned, networking becomes a very key component because unlike where you're at today, if you're on-prem, you have your internal switch stack and network and or Wi-Fi that your users are connecting to, and all that backplane is happening at the speed of your core networking, right? Or networking you're connected to. Once you take that up and you move to cloud, and again, in most cases, you've already done this to some degree because you're using O365 or a G Suite. You now have a dependency on that internet connectivity to get your data, right? To get your apps and things like that. This is even more when you move your data center because now all of the data center apps and data is out there. So you need to make sure that you've got you know, good circuits with, decent speeds, but they also, in most cases, we recommend redundancy at this point, right? Because that way, if you lose a circuit, you're still up. So those are some things you need to take into consideration that are just indicators that if you're not at that point, that may be an additional piece we have to address before we can start looking at the cloud component. Again, data transfer and lock-in, that's always a concern. So again, most of the cloud scalers have their own proprietary format of VMs that you're going to be running out there. And so unless you're using some other form or some other transform to back up and print the data and move it, it makes it a little bit harder to move that from a cloud provider to another. There are some technology and tools that are available to help us with that process, but again, you have to be aware of that as you go into this. So again, key considerations, application equipment requirements, data locality, and regulatory compliance, and then obviously speed of circuits and redundancy. So now we kind of got all that out of the way. What is the strategy and how do we get there? So we kind of have 10 kind of steps essentially that we're going to walk through here that we've kind of found kind of essentially for the projects that we've done kind of really come hit home as far as what we've seen be successful in trying to move down this model. So the first thing we're going to touch on is going to be, again, as I've mentioned, clear business objectives, right? At the end of the day, if we're moving just to move, that's not a business objective, and we're going to ultimately fail. So let's go understand what are we trying to do? Are we trying to reduce CapEx? Is it for scalability or flexibility? Is it for improved performance? I mean, in some cases that can be a reality as well. Is it for the speed of innovation, right? We need to make sure that we clearly understand what the business is trying to get out of this transition, how it helps facilitate what they're trying to get done as an organization and their objectives, and then how do we map those capabilities back and ensure that we're able to deliver upon them. So at the end of the day, when we do the migration, it's a success, and we're not going up there to just turn around and rip it all back out because that nobody wants to spend that cycle energy and effort and lost opportunity cost doing something that we didn't align properly first, and then we end up with somebody's not happy with it. We have to go back and rip it all back out. All right, so this is probably the most critical part of this, and this is where generally where we may have a little bit of help on the business side, or at least help steer that conversation with the internal IT organization and the business. But this is usually where we get engaged, right? And this is how do we assess the existing environment? Most of the cloud providers have tools. In particular, we predominantly are working out of Azure. We can't work out of the other ones, but that's one we most generally work with because most everybody has an existing Azure investment. You have Entra ID, you have O365, right? Logically continue down that path, leveraging services you've already kind of invested in. Azure has an Azure migration tool. It's a free service. We can help you get it configured and set up, get it inventorying your apps and data in the environment, and then it helps project kind of what does that roadmap look like. So this is something where we come in and we help set that configuration up. We're going to let it run for, again, ideally 30 to 45 days. We want to see that, end of month cycle, things like that, business trends in the environment. And then we can get an idea of, hey, okay, based upon your actual usage and data, here's what it might look like. Here's the opportunities to maybe move to a SQL as a service, the PaaS instance of SQL versus you having, servers within SQL licensing and then having to manage the infrastructure, the patching, everything else. Maybe we look at moving it to a PaaS instance, right? So there's some opportunities that we look at. We analyze that data and come back with, okay, here's what it might look like to start moving or segmenting things into the cloud. We look at costs. I mean, cost is a big part of this, right? We said, generally speaking, you're not maybe cost neutral, but this is not a cost savings, but we still need to understand the cost. What are we looking at monthly? Where are the costs at? Is there anything we can do to bring those costs down? And there's a couple different things. Again, if you're just swiping the credit card and putting a VM in Azure, I can tell you right now, you've done it wrong. You're paying way too much for that VM. There's a number of different things when you go and methodically go through this, we can help reduce those costs by using things like Azure Hybrid Benefits and reserved instances to significantly reduce those costs. Because if it's a VM you're going to run for 3 years, let's go commit it for 3 years and you can bring your costs down. So that's a big part of what we do here as well. Again, connectivity needs, this is huge. There are things like Azure Express Route that allow us to get a very high speed, low latency connection into Azure Backplane. Do we need that? I don't know. That's part of the evaluation cycle process that we go through. And then obviously security and compliance, this is always big. It's unfortunate the state of the world we live in, but threat actors are real and they continue to get more and more prolific and prevalent. And we always have to take that in consideration no matter where we're at and what we're doing. So again, once we've kind of determined what we have and how we're going to transition and make it, then the question is it going to go public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud, or multi-cloud? So again, this is really kind of aligning with what are the app and data requirements? Where can it live? What are the dependencies? Again, that's that whole assessment piece we have to go through. And that's a fairly invasive process. Like I said, this is not, I'm going to do this tomorrow. This is hey, let's get started 12, 18 months in advance of a potential opportunity and lay out that groundwork and framework. And that's where we've been successful with customers making transitions to the cloud, is having a strategy and making sure that every decision that the business and IT makes over the next 18 to 24 months is in line with that transition to cloud. I've had some customers say, hey, we want to get to cloud. But then they purchase infrastructure, hardware, and equipment and put it on the data center. I'm like, okay, well, you said you wanted to get to cloud, but we've made purchases and or decisions that are directly contradictive to that what we're trying to get accomplished. So again, we want to make sure we're in alignment with everyone in the organization about how we're trying to get there and make sure that we put that lens, if we're truly trying to get to cloud, on everything that we're trying to get accomplished. So again, and here's kind of how do we look to move those workloads once we identified them and those requirements into these various components, right? Whether it be public, private, hybrid, or multi-cloud. It's really kind of the 6 R's, right? So the very first one, and this is the most costly one, don't do it. I've seen people do it. It can be done, but you're going to pay more for it, right? This is lift and shift. This is literally, you're going to migrate that VM as it is into a t-shirt size instance inside of Azure and just spin it up and call it a day and walk away. That's the most ineffective way to do that. Typically what we see a lot of times, if you have an on-prem environment and you have, again, a hardware refresh, whatever it might be, most commonly what we're looking at is a replatform. And this is where we're going to lift and tinker, right? This is where we evaluate things like, hey, you have a file server on your on-prem environment. When we go to Azure, we can consume native Azure files, a platform as a service solution that gives us file capabilities without having to have a Windows OS that we have to manage and patch and maintain, and the security architecture around that, right? There's things like that we want to look at and evaluate. And when we do that, we're now moving and shifting that data into those new capabilities, right? And platform capabilities that we didn't have before because it didn't exist in our platform on premises, in our VMware or Hyper-V or Nutanix environment. This is where we have to go back and look at, okay, now we can lift and tinker and configure these things. The next one is refactor. And this is the one that I think is probably, I have some organizations doing this, but this is a very long road, right? You have to be committed to this. You have to have a DevOps team. This is basically, you're going to redesign all of your apps to run natively in the cloud with native app integrations, data plane controls in the cloud, everything else, right? You're going to completely redesign everything for that cloud factor. In most, especially for the SMB, smaller organizations that we work with, especially more on the managed services side, what we find is that typically you're going to be leveraging off-the-shelf software, or again, looking at, the next piece, which is going to be replaced, the SaaS alternatives, right? Because you're not going to be developing a lot of times apps in the environment. So typically refactor is one we don't see a lot of. It is absolutely a strategy, but it's usually going to be more at the larger enterprise scale. Replace is a pretty common one, and we try to look at this whenever we can, right? This is the opportunity when we're doing transitions to look at okay, we've always had a server and app to do this, but is there a way to do this from a SaaS perspective? Or is there another app out there that will let us do it from a SaaS perspective that maybe brings additional benefits, right? And maybe that's a better play to have. Can I have some of those? Again, this is where we may get into looking at, hey, what's your accounting backend? Okay, it's QuickBooks. Well, maybe we look at QuickBooks Cloud, right? There's things like that we have conversations around and try to understand. One of the things we see a lot too is, do we retain or retire it? In environments where we've historically kind of just brought things along. We've had these old environments. We've got these old apps. We've got that server that, Bob in 99 spun up, and it's got some data. Nobody knows what it's for, but we hate to get rid of it because we don't want to lose it, right? Part of the process is going through and evaluating, what data do we have? Do we still need it? Is it pertinent? Can it be moved someplace else? So a lot of evaluating, retain and retire. In a lot of cases, we'll see, a quarter to a third, maybe stuff that was just in the environment that we could actually shut down and get rid of or retire out by making a couple of changes and moving to some of the other platform capabilities that are in the cloud. And the final one is right size. And this one, I think Daryl was this originally started as the 5R slide, and we were kind of talking about Daryl, and Daryl was adamant this has got to be 6, right? We got to talk about right size because this is the big thing, right? If you look on-prem and you say, hey, I've got a 2 vCPU, 8 gigs of RAM, 250 gig hard disk VM, and you just recreate that in Azure, you've probably already lost from the pricing size, because that's where we bring in those analysis tools. It'll tell us, hey, yeah, you've got 2 vCPUs. You're only using ever one, right? And you're only ever using 4 gigs of RAM. Well, we can go find that t-shirt VM instance size and right size that VM, deploy it, run it out there, pilot it. If it works well, great. If we hit a situation where performance is slowed down and we need to flip that lever again, to Brian's point, again, it's not everything, but how do we twist that knob? All I've got to do is get a maintenance window, shut that VM down, change the instance size, power it back up, and I've now changed the resources. It's that easy. And that's the real power and capability we get to once we get into the cloud, is that flexibility to make those changes. Daryl, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is a key factor. I mean, if you could go back and take a look at some of the losing strategies of cloud, and look at past mistakes, a lot of people will tell you that they didn't right size the stuff the way that it should have been. And so when that first bill came in, because when we do an estimate for this, well, now we actually help everybody right size it. But when we do an estimate, it's still just an estimate. And so you really don't know what it is until it comes in. It'll be pretty close. But again, right sizing of these machines is key to the whole thing. Now, one of the things you have to get used to is looking at higher CPU, right? Because we all grew up with 5%, 10% CPU. If we went over 30% of CPU, well, then we started getting nervous. Well, now you're paying for CPU cycles, so you need to ensure that you're getting the most out of those t-shirt size VMs that you can.
Yep. Thanks, Daryl. So now that we've established the strategy for those 6Rs, sorry, man, I'm still stuck on that 5 versus 6, man. So now we get into, how do we establish the plans based on the 6Rs, right? So depending on which one of those you're going to approach, whether it be, refactor, which again, most of you probably aren't going to do. If it's the re-platform, which is most common, right? Once we've determined what we're going to re-platform, now how do we prioritize what workloads we're going to go after? What are the things that are easiest moved, that have the least number of dependencies to go out and run a pilot, right? Because that's what we really want to do. This is not something you just go and turn on and say, yes, it's going to be great, and it's going to work out the gate. You really want to pilot this. You want to deploy it out. You want to get a subset working. And again, we're typically going to look at, how do we move apps and data for various parts of the organization one at a time. And we want to find, what is that low hanging fruit that doesn't have a lot of risk, doesn't have a lot of other dependencies, that we can go and pilot on. Let's see how it works. Let's make sure we get a win. Okay, now we can go set timeline objectives to work through that whole process. And then when we get done, here's the one we've completed, and here's the roadmap for the next one, right? So that's really when we start putting together that roadmap of getting the wins. Because again, if you're trying to do the big bang, while you can be successful, you're going to leave a lot of money on the table, and there's going to be a lot of challenges along the way. That by doing a more methodical plan transition, we can certainly accomplish that much more and have a much smoother transition, less cost, and ultimately a better experience for the end user when we're all said and done. So once we've kind of got that plan, now we got to do compliance. So one of the key things you'll hear whenever we start talking about moving to the cloud and consuming cloud infrastructure is the concept of a landing zone or zones if you're doing multi-cloud or those kind of things. Landing zone is essentially, you can think of it like, hey, you have resources in a virtual data center inside of Azure or AWS or GCP. So first thing out the gate, how do you secure that perimeter of your resources? Well, that's where the landing zone comes in. This is where you put in uh, a virtual firewall appliance and the networking topology that allows you to control and monitor the network infrastructure inside of the cloud platform you're moving to. So this is probably one of the key things that people don't understand is that, yes, when you're doing this, you're not building a data center, but you're logically building one from a security and networking perspective. So you have to go through this process. And this is probably the most critical thing that we spend a lot of time with customers putting together, detailing out the requirements, and really coming together with what does this look like to ensure we can meet the requirements of not just the stuff we're migrating today, but also from looking in a forward-looking direction that needs it'll be down the road. So that's one of the key things that we have to take into consideration when you're looking to go to cloud. And this is the first thing that will get built. You don't do anything in the cloud. You could do some stuff with other services potentially, but really this is the linchpin that really helps you ensure security and compliance and control of your environment is this landing zone. The next thing we will look at is identity and access management policies. Again, if you're in Azure, it's going to be inside of Entra ID, creating the roles and the access people need to be able to see what they need to see. This is where, again, as we talk about, there's a lot of this comes back into financial operations, not necessarily just IT operations. So in a lot of cases, you're going to have to be working closely with your accountants or the business who's going to oversee spending, right? And they need to have access to get in here to see that spending, but you don't want them to have access to be able to change anything, right? And so that's where we need to create very delegated roles in this identity and access management to give them rights to be able to see and do what they need to do to help monitor and control costs, understand what's going on in the environment, but not have the ability to make any changes. One of the key pieces when you move into a cloud is how are you going to encrypt and secure your data, right? And there's a number of different ways you can do that. By default, out the gate, they do encryption at rest, but they're using Microsoft keys to do that encryption. If you want to have your own encryption, you need to bring your own key. So now, how do we bring our own keys? How do we get that configured? How do we maintain and manage those? Right? If we want to do in transit, we've got to do additional components to make sure we have in transit encryption in place. So again, that's a very key piece is that, okay, this data is now out and moving. How do we want to ensure and secure that today? Backup in DR, right? Obviously, just because we're in the cloud and it's, fairly scalable and resilient doesn't mean we don't need to still take into consideration backup in DR. Those scenarios get a little easier once we're in the cloud because there's multiple things we can do. We can replicate data to a secondary region and we can recover there whenever we want. Or there's other things we can do. And again, if you're really worried about one cloud provider being down versus another, that's where we get into the multi-cloud. And then how do we, replicate data, sync data? There's other technologies and conversations that come into play in that piece. And again, always regulatory requirements, making sure we're being compliant no matter where we're at, those regulatory requirements across the environment. Finally, we have optimizing performance and costs. So again, as Darrell had mentioned, this is where right size resources comes in again, right? Again, the big thing that we have seen that is probably one of the hardest transitions or struggles or understandings is that when you go to the cloud, you're still managing IT, but some of that's been moved into the cloud provider in terms of how you consume it. So what you almost, but while that's gone away, what you end up doing is having to operationalize and manage the financial side of it and the costing and making sure you're watching for those opportunities to reduce costs, to maintain costs, or in the case, hey, someone needed a backup. We restored a VM to grab some data off of it and we left it running. Well, unfortunately now, if it's in Azure or GCP or AWS, that's a bill that's just ticking, right? And if somebody's not keeping an eye on that, if you haven't set up cost alerting to let you know that, hey, you're running high for the month, you might want to take a look at it. You're not going to know, and you're going to get hit with a bill, and you're going to see, why did I just spend an extra $3,000 that I wasn't expecting, right? Now you got to go back and find it, and you got to turn it off, but now you've already got into that next bill cycle, right? So it's things like that you got to be very much aware of. Again, we mentioned reserved instances earlier. This is where you're committing to a cloud provider that, hey, I'm going to use some of your resources for a period of time, So I'm going to be there, and because of that, they give you a reduced cost. Again, the monitoring is obviously key as well. And there's a number of tools in the various cloud providers, and there's also then third-party tools that we've looked at and are bringing to bear as well to help handle both from the performance as well as the financial operations side of these environments. Part of this is, how are you going to operationalize and manage this environment, right? You gotta figure out how to, what does your cloud security policy even look like, right? Do you have policies written in general for security? We need to make sure we're adopting and maintaining the security posturing as we move into a cloud environment. Do you have DevOps? Are you going to be doing new cloud or new application development out there? You may need to have a DevOps team to help maintain and manage that. Again, financial operations. It may be existing people putting on some new hats, or you may need to have a team, depending on the size and scope of what you're doing, that's going to be dedicated just to helping to monitor and manage the financial costs of the environment. Cloud governance is big. This says, how do you create VMs? How do you use a naming convention? Because again, this can get very confusing when you're setting up a bunch of services and they may all look the same name, but you guys have VM1 and VM2 and whatever else, right? How do you make sense of that when you're all logically in the cloud and trying to manage that? So some cloud governance around naming conventions, things like that is also important. And then again, it's continuous improvement. That's what, we talked about that very early on, is that going to cloud is not I'm there and I'm done, right? It's not like an infrastructure platform upgrade. I do it and then I'm done. This is where you want to continue to be aware, because cloud evolves in such a rapid scale that there may be a new service tomorrow that solves a problem that you have or allows you to reduce the spend on a physical infrastructure as a service VM that's running an application, because now that app functionality can be just delivered as a platform as a service, or maybe even as a SaaS solution inside of the environment. And so we can quickly and nimbly spin that up, run it, pilot it, test it, and if it's good, move data over to it and transition off of it and shut the IaaS down, and then we just save some costs, right? So this is the kind of the continuous improvement things we're always kind of monitoring and looking for in the environment as well. So again, test, validate, and go live. So one of the big things we need to make sure we have time to do, and we want to go through the process, is we want to obviously conduct performance testing, right? We're moving these data and these workloads from what was on-prem to the cloud. We want to make sure that we do adequate testing to ensure performance. We want to validate that our security controls are in place and we're getting alerts and the monitoring that we need to have in the event that we need to go back and track something down. We want to have a rollback plan, right? If you're going to try to go to the cloud, you want to make sure you've got a way to roll back if something doesn't go well. And maybe it's the initial pilot, maybe it's you're partway through and something doesn't work out. How do we roll back? How do we get back to where we were? And then maybe sync and reevaluate. Again, this is key. I recommend it for everyone. Start with easy wins, things that are logically easy, maybe smaller departments, user groups, things like that are going to be easier migrated. They don't have a lot of existing dependencies. One of the biggest challenges in some cases is going to just be you're moving the end user's cheese. And I can't, it's funny to say that, but I've run into that more often than not. If you move an icon on a desktop 2 inches to the right, someone is going to complain, right? I don't care. I don't care what organization you're like. You're going to ruin somebody's day, right? Well, when you start looking at moving to cloud, you may be changing how we access, maybe what we're accessing. Maybe we're changing some file paths, right? There's some things we can do to help kind of mask that from the users in certain situations, but you still need to understand their impact. And you need to make sure that you've communicated with them, like, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And then here's how you adopt and leverage this technology. So you want to have good documentation. Then you want to train your end users. And you have to make sure that you're ready for day one support. So if you're going to go live, and a lot of times we recommend, we do cutovers, overnight. That way we got a chance to kind of pilot the system before the users come onto it. And then when the users come on, we're there to help support day one, right? What are the things maybe we didn't catch, or maybe we didn't have enough users, testers? There's always something, right? In IT, we've all been through cutovers. There's always something a little niche use case we missed, right? So being available and ready to quickly and rapidly address those and move those forward so that it doesn't become, hey, cloud was awful because we tried to transition and Larry over in finance couldn't do his job for a week, right? We don't want to have that situation. We make sure we're planning for those kind of things. All right. And so the kind of the final part of the strategy, guys, is really going to be continuous monitoring and optimization, right? And this is where, we do this for a lot of our customers today on the managed services side when we've been through these transitions where we're bringing tools to bear. But at the end of the day, there's built-in tools in the platforms, right? That they're going to help you do some of these capabilities. Again, they're going to help monitor performance, help optimize your spend. They're going to help you with your security in the environment. And then again, at the end of the day, we need to be constantly evaluating what's my additional cloud expansion. How do I take advantage of maybe new services or resources that are out there, or maybe I didn't move everything, or I have a new business case or use case that now I want to look at moving to cloud. So that's kind of where we continue to iterate on this process over and over and over. But like I said, it's a process, guys. This takes time. Um, we'd love to help you through that process. So with that, that's kind of what we have from a presentation today, kind of get you thinking about the process, what it takes, how to get started. Again, we've done a number of these with some of our customers and we've been very successful, but it's been a process working with those customers. In some cases, it's been a 3 to 5 year process where we've been engaged from the very beginning. We established there's some business criteria, why we want to try to get there, how do we map those criteria, and how we start making business decisions today that ultimately get us to where we can make those transitions 4 or 5 years down the road. So again, hopefully this was helpful for you guys. I don't know if I saw any questions come in. It doesn't look like there's any questions as of right now that I can see, but we've got a few minutes. So if you have any questions or anything you'd like to ask, Daryl and I'll be here for a couple more minutes yet. Otherwise, we appreciate you guys being here today. Hopefully this was insightful. If you do have a minute, we'd appreciate if you take a moment to finish completing the survey. Again, I hope you all wanted those steaks that look delicious, and it's about lunchtime, so I'm not sure what I'm going to do about that. But anyway, we thank you for your time, folks, and we'll open up for just a couple minutes here for questions.
Yeah.